Hello and welcome to this special episode of Friend of the Court, where we are going to go behind the scenes and talk to the makers of the show. We are recording this before the season finale, and even though I know how it ends, I still can't wait to see how it all plays out. I'm Vikram Shah, a writer and editor. I also happen to have a law degree. In the past, I've worked with a digital magazine called 52 and the features publication Mint Lounge. And like many of you listening, I've been tripping on Friend of the Court season 2, which, as again many of you know, is about India's most historic legal case, Keswanan Bharti versus State of Kerala. If I had to summarize the case in a line, which is a very hard thing to do, it was about whether some parts of the Indian constitution are so sacred that even the parliament can't amend them. And that's what's come to be called the basic structure of the constitution. And I'll tell you why basic structure is a really big deal. It's because it's about how we see ourselves as a nation, right? It's about what kind of values are non negotiable. A lot of people who were involved with putting the podcast together here today with me. There's Ramya Boddupalli, who's project lead for Friend of the Court at the Anil Devan Foundation, which has produced the podcast. Ramya is a co-researcher and co-writer of this podcast. And I personally know that she's just generally given her days and nights to this for the past few months. There's also Bhavya Dore, freelance journalist and writer extraordinaire. Bhavya has co-researched and co-written this podcast with Ramya. There's Lawrence Liang. You would have heard him tell some very juicy anecdotes on the podcast. His day job is Dean of the School of Law, Governance and Citizenship at the Ambedkar University in Delhi. He's also an advisor to the Anil Devan Foundation and the discoverer of the Diaries of Anil Devan, which is one of the reasons that this podcast exists. Gaurav Vaz is also with us, producer and maestro of all things to do with audio, sound. So if you like the title track, background music, all of that is down to Gaurav and his amazingly talented team. You know, back in law school, Keswanan Bharti used to be shorthand for everything that was long and tedious and boring because the judgment is more than 500 pages long and there are 13 judges on the bench. But somehow, the team behind Friend of the Court has miraculously turned this into a thrilling, high stakes story, like almost an edge of your seat story about politics, personalities, and courtroom drama. And in this making of episode, we're going to pick their brains and we're going to talk about just how they managed to do this.
The future constitution of India.
All the world admires a deed well done. We can say that we have done this action well.
Getting right into it, I want to know why Keshwanan Bharti, because it is a daunting idea to even think about it. So why Keshwanan Bharti and why the podcast format? Lawrence, I think if you want to kind of get into that.
Sure. Thanks, Vikram. Before I start, first want to say that, it's been an absolute pleasure working with Ramya and Bhavya on this, and also very appreciative of what Gaurav has done along with Sachi on the sound, because, we are familiar with what it looks like and what it perhaps sounds like on text. But to hear it in its podcast form has actually been rather magical. Why did we choose to tell the story of Keshwanan Bharti? Because it needed to be told. It's a story that's familiar to a very large number of people, especially in the legal profession and, for law students and legal academics. But it's a story that I think needed to be told to a much wider audience. There are hundreds of thousands of Supreme Court and High Court cases over the last, 75 years. But there are cases and then there is the case. And in that sense, Keshwanand Bharti is the case. Just a little bit of background here. Initially, the entire project of the podcast, which began with season one, began with a desire to do something with the notes that Mr. Anil Devan had left behind of the cases that he'd been involved with. And he'd been involved with, obviously, apart from Keshwan Bharti, a large number of extremely important kind of public cases, some of which we dealt with in season one. And when I initially looked at the notes, I realized that it'd be very difficult to actually convert some of these notes into a book, which would still retain, in a way, the original flavor of the handwritten notes and the personal reflections. But going through them, I realized that what could be done was to actually figure out a format where we could tell the story of great constitutional cases and how they shaped Indian history. And because I was listening to a few kind of legal podcasts at that point of time, figured that, wow, we actually don't have too many of these kind of forms to tell important legal stories. And that's when we actually started working on the podcast as a format. The podcast as a format allows us all kinds of flexibilities. For one, it's a highly emotive medium. So you're bringing alive what would otherwise be relatively dry legal debates. And I think that that is, a perfect medium to tell a story like Ishwanan Bharti. Keshwanand Bharti, like any good blockbuster, has a little bit of everything. It has intrigue, it has drama, it has suspense, it has larger than life characters. Perhaps the only thing missing is romance. We might have to do another kind of subaltern history of what the romantic stories behind Keshwanand Bharti were. But it has a little bit of everything. My personal interest in the area has always been in the intersection between law and popular culture. So my own work is on the filmic representations of law and justice in India. So my sense was that here was a story which didn't even need to be fictionalized, because it had a lot more than what fiction could offer. And the podcast format seemed to allow for it because it allowed you to interview people, it allowed you to weave in audio material, archival material. And I think Ramya and Bhavya, once they sunk their teeth into it, managed to dig up such incredible material that allowed us to tell the story in this way.
Yeah, and epic it is, right? I think you use the word epic to describe it. This big kind of sprawling case with all these various strands, and I think the podcast is an interesting. It offers like an interesting narrative structure to bring it all together. I'd love to ask Ramya and Gaurav actually if there were references in mind. Was there stuff that you were listening to, and what was that like?
Hi, Vikram. Thanks for the question. And again, it's been an absolute pleasure and a thrill to work on this series with Bhavya, Lawrence, and Gaurav and the rest of the team. As for the podcast references that we had in mind, we mostly were looking at American shows like The Slow Burn. That was what I had in mind right from the beginning, even for season one. Slow Burn, of course, is a Slate. It is produced by Slate Magazine, and it used to be hosted by Leon Neyfakh. And their first season was about the Watergate scandal, and then they've done I think 8 seasons now, and they have a similar template where they tell the stories of important political events and court cases, and situate them in their political context and their social context. So that was our main inspiration, that we need to, have a retelling of important legal cases in India in a similar manner. And then, of course, Gaurav himself had certain references for how, the style should be, the writing style, or even how Raghu should be narrating it.
For me, it was a couple of things. One, I didn't want a podcast eventually that I myself would find hard to listen to. And I'm not anywhere close to as legally minded as the rest of you. So it was something that I can understand and keeps me engaged, would be something that I thought people like me would like. And that's what I set out to produce. That was point one. And secondly, while the comparisons to Slow Burn or rather the inspiration from Slow Burn and Radio Lab and really nicely produced podcasts are fantastic, us Indians are horrible at documenting our culture and history. But with many of the podcasts I've produced in India in the past, I've realized that we're really bad at documenting our own story. So the truest form of the story that we could tell was, I think, what we aimed to get to. And being able to get some of these original notes, being able to speak to people who were in the courtroom arguing or part of the teams that argued these cases is something that you wouldn't otherwise, even in any sort of book format or any writing from that time, get one wholesome picture of it.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, one thing you mentioned, Gaurav, I think was something that I was thinking about while listening to all the episodes, and actually marveling at how you'll have kind of simplified it and made it more accessible, right? That's what you said, that you want someone without a legal background or without even knowing what this case is about. You want someone who stumbles across it on a podcast app to come in and listen to it. And so the question that I want to ask Ramya and Bhavya, sort of from a writing room perspective, is that like a 101 would also mean, like, trying to break it down and explain it would also mean that, you know, the law geeks, people who are all over this case and you know, who studied it and thought about it and argued it, there wouldn't be much new in it for them, right? And that would also be like a big part of your audience. People are just so excited. I've seen so many lawyers on Twitter, just they're so excited that there's content around this, and you know, people are saying such nice things. But anything too technical and you kind of lose the lay audience. So what was that negotiation like for you, Ramya, and for you, Bhavya, in the writing room?
Neither Bhavya nor I are lawyers, although I majored in political science in college and I also have a master's in law and politics. So I was familiar with the story, but not very much with the judgment or with the arguments in court. So, and our first, at least in this project, our first introduction to the case or the material was Anil Devan's notes. And apart from the written submissions that, you know, he kept in his office, uh, he also had registers of written notes in his own handwriting about what was happening in court. And, you know, there were also a lot of interesting stray notes that we couldn't include in the show. You know, I think I remember reading about uh, him noting down that HM Sirvai changed his spectacles after lunch break one of the days. So it was these kind of things that humanized these characters. And of course, there were these other anecdotes about Dilip Kumar coming to court and then, you know, these lawyers hijacking cars and things like that. So we knew that there was potential, but at the same time, we are a podcast that talks about these things. So we had three of us in the writing room. It was our legal researcher, Aishwarya Chaturvedi. You know, she's a lawyer by training. So she would break down these, you know, complex legal concepts for us. Through her, we understood how the court's stand changed through these 13 years. And then I was mainly doing the political research, connecting what was happening in court to, you know, the political events of the day, and then doing sort of the first draft. And then, of course, Bhavya also did some of the first drafts this season. And also, you know, she was our first round of editing where she would just do some restructuring to the scripts and things like that. But once that was done, I think we had our first drafts of the script ready sometime by May end, I think. And after that, it was just 4 months of Bhavya, myself, Lawrence, Raghu, and Supriya, and even Gaurav just sitting down, sometimes taking, you know, half a day or maybe 2 days to just simplify one sentence and just saying, like, how do we simplify what is how do we simplify the relationship between Article 13 and 368? And Bhavya also helpful because she came to this almost totally green. So, and she was the ideal candidate for our, you know, as a sample for our audience also. So, like, if she doesn't understand it, then we can't go forward. And at times she would just say, no, it's okay. You can, you don't have to pay attention to, what I think. But I'm like, no, I need to pay attention to what you think, because if I can't explain it to you, we can't like possibly move forward. I'll let Bhavya also weigh in on, what she thought about this whole process.
Yeah, like Ramya said, it was a constant negotiation between how much technical stuff you put in and who is the audience you're speaking to is ultimately the question, right? So that's also possibly a shape shifting figure. It could be a lawyer who knows the case very well. It could be a relatively non-informed person on this. So yeah, there was a constant debate about who we are catering to and how do we best serve that imaginary listener. And there were many times where I didn't understand what was going on. Even like way months into the story, I would come back and ask very dumb, basic questions. But you have to do that, right? Otherwise, you're going to tell people something that you don't understand, that then you're not going to be doing a very good job of explaining to it. And like I told Ramya at some points during the story, I'm like, there's that rule, right, where you say that if you have to break down a difficult concept, are you able to explain it to your mother? If you are, then you've done it successfully. So all I could think of was trying to explain it to my mother and her saying in Tamil, I just don't understand anything. So there was that voice at the back of my head. And if so it you just have to keep stopping and asking yourself, does this make sense? Am I getting what I'm writing? Or just rewind and rework. And so yeah, there was a constant process of back and forth and reworking.
Got it. And Lawrence, since he sort of mentioned the Constitution and love, and I know Bhavya, you have covered the more unglamorous reaches of our legal system, which is the criminal courts, before as a journalist. But did you, and you, Ramya, did you fall in love with the Constitution? Like, how did you come out of it thinking that is this something that you'd want to defend to death?
I think we, developed feelings for some of the historical personalities here. It's also been quite surreal, writing it in this particular year, because when we started writing this podcast, the basic structure was, of course, a very important part of our, constitutional life. But we started work in earnest in January this year. And at that time, that was the first time that the vice president questioned the basic structure in parliament. And I don't remember his exact words, but I think he said he couldn't respect that doctrine. And at that point, we're like, okay, at least this is going to, keep this 50-year-old case in the news. So it's great for us to generate interest amongst the audience. And then as the year went on, by the time we were, at the fag end of our writing, you had the former Chief Justice and present Rajya Sabha MP Ranjan Gogoi questioning and, saying that the doctrine has a doubtful basis. And in those 8 months, we were just in the trenches, reading up on what Palkhiwala was saying, what Indira Gandhi was doing, what CY was saying in court. So at least for me, it was a journey that at the end of which I was definitely more attuned to why this story needs to be told, and because just the parallels are so eerie. And also, you're reading about, for instance, back in the 1970s, you're reading about someone like Kumaramangalam calling for a committed judiciary, or he's talking about judges having a certain outlook. And you see strains of that happening around you as well. And, you just realize that these uh, debates are far from over, and, they could reignite any moment. And also, that's also why we need to remember this story.
Thanks, Ramya. I know that's super interesting, and I want to throw this to Gaurav now, about kind of the background. What is it like to score this season? The background score, the title track. I read somewhere recently that acting is 60% voice, and I feel like podcast is 60% or more than that sound. Right? It's what people talk about when they say that. Oh, I love listening to this narrative podcast. What kind of keeps you in. So, what was it like to score the season?
This was actually the title track was actually pre-created. Luckily for us, I think the brief from Ramya when we first started was to make a podcast that wasn't overly produced, but just engaging at the same time. So the idea, at least for Sachi and me, when we started thinking about this, was how can we add enough music to with narrative podcasts. At least my philosophy is, just as you're beginning to tune out, because you can't listen to someone's monotone voice for a long time, and when you're explaining legal concepts, there's no, you can't dramatize it in your voice. You have to explain it in a way that's clear. So as Raghu is going through, and if you're starting to tune out, or even as a guest voice is speaking for a duration, and as you're starting to tune out, can I introduce some music that suddenly brings you back to it? To just, oh, what's happening now? Let me pay attention for some more time, and music weaves in and out. The addition of the clips from the past, and I really fought for this, was was something that just worked, especially the Ambedkar speech, right? At the first thing you hear is Ambedkar, and then Indira Gandhi, and then Palgiwala. The Palkiwala edition was something Ramya fought for, and the Ambedkar edition was something I fought for. Though Ambedkar's quotes don't feature in the podcast at all. He was critical and instrumental in writing the Constitution, which is where this whole thing stems from. So for me, he was, and it also just sounds great when it starts with that rousing line. Uh, the idea was to I think in the last season, Ramya was very partial to uh, the violins, and she really wanted to retain as much of a violin based musical score, though we tried to push her further and further away from it. This was the compromise we arrived at.
Also, shout out to Sachi. She's done such a phenomenal job. And at first, I'll be totally honest here, I was a little nervous because, this is a big case again, and, would she get the subtext and all of that? But she's done such a fantastic job. Phenomenal, absolutely.
With legal text, you're always accustomed to reading them on the page, but you know that half of what actually happens in a courtroom happens through gesture, through tone. And it's very difficult when you're reading a text to actually recreate that. And what I found quite remarkable about, this coming together between Ramya and Bhavya's writing and Gaurav and Sachi's, kind of sound design and music, was it actually captured mood, and it located Keshwananda not just in terms of the history of fact or the history of law. What it managed to do was really create, in a way, an atmosphere of for Keshwananda Bharati.
And I think another thing that obviously contributes to this thing of multiple voices and you keep changing it up is, of course, your interviewees. I mean, these are doyens of the bar, like some of the biggest names in sort of law and litigation in India. And you got them to narrate these absolutely fantastic, riveting anecdotes. What was that like?
So for the first few interviews which we did in person with two of the original surviving participants, we had made lists of stuff that we knew had happened, and then we wanted to jog their memories on that. And you have to remember that at least 3 or 4 of our interviewees are over the age of 85. So it's not like you can just turn on the button and like a jukebox, they're just going to say everything, right? It will require some prodding, some memory and recall and all of that. So yeah, for those first few interviews, we were also new into the process. So we also had to remind ourselves that, okay, this incident happened, this happened, we have to get him to talk about this judge or that date or this judgment. So yeah, but then as you go along, you become more of a well-oiled machine. And then you also, of course, like with every interview, you go in with a certain set of questions, and then it all just spontaneously evolves and flows from there. And then obviously they're also going to tell you new stuff, and there's going to be discovery along the way. And yeah, that's about. And then some of the interviews we did online, I mean, generally you get better stuff when you meet someone, but you couldn't be flying all over the country to meet people. So many of the interviews were online. And in a few cases, maybe people asked us for questions in advance because they wanted to remember what had happened. So we did some of that.
Yeah, and we also sat and with some of our interviews, especially the ones that we did in person, Nayantara Sehgal, Sandeep Thakur, who passed away while I think 2 days after the podcast was released, Dandiwala, we sat and chatted with them for almost hour and a half, 2 hours, and they were quite patient. Initially, I think, most of them were a little unsure of what's happening. Podcast is a new format; people are not familiar with it, and many of them thought that we're going to be video recording them as well, so they would turn up all prim and proper. And then we'd say, like, just relax, you can be in your pajamas or whatever. But and then it would take them about 20-25 minutes to warm up, and then they would realize that Bhavya and I are just like all ears. We're just listening to their stories. We're just there for their stories and not cross questioning them in any serious manner. So and then they would warm up, and all the stories would tumble out one after the other. And then of course it was left to us about how we incorporated that into the script. There were also some interviews, especially Lawrence. I think we recorded with him thrice because he was also our in-house expert. So we exploited him to the maximum. And we would just say, Lawrence, we need this additional quote there, we need this additional quote here. And I think Lawrence was the longest interview, even the first one that we did. I think it was about 2 hours or something. And I think you also mentioned about like how did we get them to um, especially experts like Lawrence, Namita Wahi, Gautam Bhatia, how do we get them to like break these things down so lucidly? Um, Again, it was a combination of which parts of the interview that we're picking up without of course being mindful of not misquoting them, and of course writing it in the script. So sometimes it would mean that in the script, in the lead up to that excerpt, you're doing a long explanation, or you're doing a long explanation after that. So Nayantara Sehgal, again, we'd gone down to her place. We first tried interviewing her online, but she wasn't able to figure out Riverside. So we flew down to Dehradun, and again, super sweet, very welcoming. We entered the house. I think I was the only one who went, and you just see pictures of Nehru all over the walls. Nehru and her mother, Nayantara Sehgal's mother, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, in like casual family pictures. That was quite surreal. But I think the interview that will stay the longest with both Bhavya and me would be Sandeep Thakur's interview. He was 89 when we spoke to him, and he had a tongue surgery about 8 years ago or something, and it impaired his speech. But he was so enthusiastic throughout the interview, just full of stories and waiting to tell us those stories. It also felt like these people were just waiting for someone to ask, right? And we were here to people who looked relatively young and were interested in these stories from 50 years ago. I think they were all just quite stumped by that fact alone, and they were just more than willing to tell us their stories.
In terms of the breaking down of the legal concepts, in the long conversations I had with Bhavya and Ramya, for me, it was very clear. There was something called the Bhavya litmus test, which was marked by how much Bhavya was frowning, right? So if she continued frowning, then you knew that you hadn't broken down the concept, and then you'd have to go all over again. And I think that there was one particular section, which after months of work, Bhavya basically very kind of straight talk says, I still don't get this, 13368 kind of thing. And that, creates a bit of panic. So then you try all over again. And I hope that we pass the Bhavya frown litmus test for the listener.
Yeah, I'm not going to blame Bhavya because I mean on episode 5 or 6, I think there's a whole set piece about the case being reviewed in front of Justice Ray's bench, if I'm not mistaken, and one of the judges themselves, or two of the judges, say that we don't understand this judgment. So there are Supreme Court judges sitting there saying that we don't understand what's going on, and that obviously annoys Mr. Nani Palkiwala a lot. And all of these fascinating kind of characters, right? They were just, like you said, they're characters in their own right. And all the anecdotes that you kind of narrate through the episode show like different facets of their personality, their own kind of little rivalries with each other, and like their friendships and all of that. Lawrence, I'll put this to you. If you were casting for screen, right, tomorrow, if someone comes and says to you that, we should adapt this into a series on an OTT platform, and, you're casting for these characters, who would you get to play who? Is something I'm curious about.
So here's a confession, right, Vikram? Which is the fact that I already have an answer to this shows you that we have been thinking about this for a while. And we have already imagined the possibilities of this becoming a TV series or a film because it deserves it. So I have my two candidates as far as, Palkiwala and Sirvai are concerned. And this is not, it only coincidentally happens to map out on two Parsi actors. But I think Boman Irani would make a rather good Palkiwala. With the right makeup, etc. He would get the tone. He has that kind of, the sense of the erudition that he would be able to convey. And given that, Sirva, in terms of how he looked, he was, lean, tall, sharp nosed, very proper. I mean, kind of dropped out of Cambridge into Bombay, right? Like the old elite Parsis did. I think Jim Sarb might be a good Sirvai. And finally, of course, who would play Indira Gandhi? So I haven't seen, Sam Bahadur. Once I watch it, then we'll take a call on whether to retain, Sania, not Sania.
It was Fatima Sana Sheikh. Yeah.
Yeah. We'll see about whether we retain her or find someone else.
Yeah. And I hope someone's listening who can like make this happen, make this come alive. Just call us. Okay, then just to kind of sort of round things up and bring it back to the present day. I think Ramya touched upon this earlier. There's a lot of contemporary like chat about the relevance of the basic structure doctrine, and there's been a lot of chat about the case this year because of the 50th anniversary. The Supreme Court's released a video kind of commemorating the case in a bunch of languages. And even after that bit, I think when the vice president kind of called the basic structure doctrine into question, the current chief justice very subtly, or I think said that it's in a context that it's the North Star. Keshwanand Bharti is the North Star kind of judgment. Where do you think we're at, with this, and what is the overall relevance of this doctrine today?
I'll just say one thing about how Justice Chandrachud has expressed his views about the basic structure in the public domain, and then probably hand this question over to Lawrence. This comment that he made about the North Star was probably late last year, probably early this year. And it's very interesting that, once these comments have started coming from the government questioning the basic structure. And I think it was in August this year that he was speaking at the Ram Jethmalani Memorial Lecture. It was a centenary lecture. And the topic of the lecture was the basic structure and whether it has served our democracy well. And he just refused to wade into the topic. He said, that's something that I would do through my judgments and not through off the court pronouncements. And that tells you something about the shift in the discourse.
Yeah, if we go back to the courtroom, particularly to Nani Palkiwala's arguments, Palkiwala was sounding a warning bell, right, in a lot of his arguments about the dangers of parliamentary supremacy if an authoritarian regime were to come into place. And a lot of his arguments were being kind of refuted by the other side, saying that you're basically fear mongering here. I think what is really incredible about the Keshwanand Bharti case is that it's a legal judgment that, in a way, was ratified by politics. Because everything that the judgment warned of came true in the emergency. And in this kind of very, very dark period of Indian history, where something so fundamental as whether or not India would remain a democracy was up for grabs, because it wasn't, for between 75 to 77, you have this kind of really a kind of a situation where you're at a crossroad about whether you will continue to remain a democracy or slide entirely into authoritarianism. And the one shining hope that emerged from all of that was Keshwanand Bharti. Because Keshwanand Bharti said that, that your commitment is not to a very narrow horizon of political interest. Your commitment cannot be to a very narrow temporal horizon of what is important today and what makes, kind of what is expedient today. There has to be a commitment to something which is larger. And that intangible value that you're committed to in the form of the basic structure of the Constitution, I think that really the reason why we use the word epic for the case is that more than merely its legal value, Keshwanand Bharti takes on the role of really, bearing the burden of having a mythic and a symbolic value. And I think this is really why even today, at a time when there are all kinds of political uncertainties, when we see echoes from the past in contemporary politics, etc., Keshwanand Bharti stands both as a legal but also as a symbolic bulwark against the possibility of any kind of slide to authoritarianism. As a legal doctrine, it's come under heavy criticism. And as a legal doctrine, one could say that, Keshwanand Bharti and the basic structure doctrine is relatively leaky. So it might be a leaky umbrella, but it's the only one you have when it rains, and we'll hold on to it.
A special sort of hat tip to Raghu Karnat, who was the narrator of this podcast. Of course, someone himself with such a strong sense of history, with all the books that he's written and kind of the work that he does as a journalist and a writer. Um, how did how did you zero in on Raghu? I know that he narrated the first season too, so maybe you can kind of take us back to sort of the initial conversations with him and why Raghu and how did that work? Did y'all were y'all around when he was recording in the studio as writers?
Yes. So Raghu, we reached out to him back in April 2021, just before the second wave of COVID hit. And I wrote a very formal email to him saying, "Oh, dear Mr. Raghu Karnad, would you be interested in doing this?" And he immediately wrote back saying that he was quite keen on doing it. And at that point, we had just one script of the Jain Hawala Diaries, the first episode ready, and it was uh, nowhere near as polished as it sounds in the episode. But he just I guess he saw the potential in it, and he came on board immediately. He gave pretty invaluable guidance as to like how should you approach a story and how do you write it out and things like that. And then when it came to the recordings, also, before we went into recordings, especially this season, we did table reads for each of the episodes. And we insisted that we need to do it for every episode because, again, just the magnitude of this case and the concepts involved. And we obviously didn't want him to say anything that he was not comfortable saying, whether it was the tone or whether it was particular words or whatever it may be. So we met in Bombay sometimes, we met online sometimes, and we would just spend 3 or 4 hours perhaps on each script, going line by line, making sure that it is. Again, it was a process of negotiation where he we were mostly in agreement, but there were certain points where he would want to say it a certain way, and we would have to make sure again that it was accurate and it was flowing well with the rest of the story and all of that. Um, and then, of course, Gaurav gave him a few pointers about how the tone that he should adopt while narrating it. And I think the only brief he had was it should feel like you're sitting in the room and telling, a room full of people this story. And I think he's nailed that, absolutely nailed it this time. And then of course, even in studio, we were with him. Again, it's just that it is this case, right? It is so heavy, it is so technical, and like we just heard, Bhavya had questions about some of the concepts, even after months of working on it. So it's not easy to wrap your head around it. So, which is why we wanted to be in the studio, just to make sure that while Raghu is reading it, there are no hiccups. And even beyond, just the outward things like his voice, which is just butter. You just know that someone like Raghu Karnad, he just makes it so believable that he knows the story and he's telling you the story. Again, it's got to do with his own background in political writing and political journalism. And I think the only time that we were a little, I wouldn't say unsure, but we were, in two minds about him as a host was, again, this is because the time period in which this story is set, there are absolutely no women, or except for Nayantara Sehgal and Namita Wahi as a commentator in the story as guest speakers. So we would have liked it if we had a woman host, but Raghu's just such a great fit, and this whole woman question goes out of the window the moment you look at our writer's room, which is just filled with women running it. And of course, we also had Supriya Nair helping us with the editing.
I'm going to ask something that's been on the minds of a lot of your listeners, and that is, what is coming after this? Like, is it going to be another big case, or are you going to try something different? But what's next from the Anil Devan Foundation stables?
So without committing absolutely, because we still to do all the work for it, it's going to be very different. We initially thought about possibilities. One possibility was, a kind of grand history of civil liberties in India. Another one was on great legal trials that have shaped Indian history. But having gone through, a range of emotions while working on season 2, what we want to do for season 3 is actually the story of law and emotions, an emotional history of law told through rage, passion, grief, love, anger, jealousy, etc. So, yeah, we don't know much beyond that, but hopefully it should be as fun and as informative as the first 2 seasons were.
Great thing I think that's come out of this discussion, this little discussion that we've had here, is some very compelling insights about what it takes to put together a world-class narrative podcast. And I think this gives a very sharp sense of like the months worth of research, writing, rewriting, audio design, interviewing, coordination, all of it that has gone behind each episode of 30 to 45 minutes. So having said all this, can't wait to see what you guys are cooking up for season 3. You've given us a bit of a teaser already, and it sounds super interesting, and hopefully we can come back next season and do this again.